All right. So I'm using my tassel. No, I'm kidding. First, I'd like to thank CV for bringing this to me from Morocco. Isn't it beautiful? It's very nice. And yeah, I will second that for Seven and Sid. We had a lot of fun on that dance floor, so thank you for making it funky. So I'm going to get right to it. I'm going to tell you up front that I am going to be a Scorpio. You can see the topic, astrology. Thank you, 2 snaps up. I'm with that. Astrology and resilience. And so this is going to be a little heavier than I think maybe some of the other talks, but I think it will prove just as helpful. If I can advance the slide. There we go. No, I got it. So it would be incomplete to start this without Nietzsche. And you know, my introduction to this quote, and I'm speaking to Gen Xers here, was Conan the Barbarian. And it opens up with this line, but not the full line, but it's out of life's school of war. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and that's credited to Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols. And of course, as you look at his chart, you can see it's a Scorpio rising, who would say something like this: with a Sun and Pluto opposition to the exact degree. So of course, he might say something like, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. With Mars also being conjoined to the MC. And so I think there's a lot to be said about that statement. But what's really remarkable about that statement, as I've thought about it over the years, that it also could be true, that which does not kill me just pisses me off. And I think that is probably what I think about. So I also have this on my refrigerator. Dear whatever doesn't kill me, I'm strong enough now. Thanks, leave me the fuck alone. It doesn't say that part, but we can all relate to that sensibility that it really just gets hard. But I'm moved to talk about resilience, and resilience to what and for what. So we're talking about resilience related to trauma, and there's a very good book that I came across that I would recommend to you. And it's Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, How Trauma Works and How We Can Heal from It, by Paul Conte, who is also an MD. And he says that trauma can be defined as anything that causes emotional or physical pain and leaves its mark on a person as life moves forward. And I like that because it really does encapsulate, you know, we sometimes think trauma could be anything like, I stubbed my toe, right? But it's not necessarily that stays with us as we move forward. And one of the things that Conte also talks about is how trauma really behaves like a virus, rewiring our lives, our brains, our bodies, and then having to pass that on to others and into our genes. We've heard of generational trauma and experienced generational trauma. So these are things that we unpack. So resilience is more than just what or who tries to kill you. It's also perhaps more about a desire and a commitment to feel better and become healthier. So I want to give that definition of resilience as well, rather than just focusing on the trauma. We have to have new measures of strength and how we are generative, meaning creative with ourselves. So I want to talk about someone else. How many of you have heard of William Ernest Henley? As you can see, he lived a very short life, 1849 to 1903. And what's significant about him is that he actually was, and his daughter, Wendy, well, her name wasn't Wendy, but his daughter was the inspiration for Wendy for J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. He was inspiration for Long John Silver from Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson. So he had this interesting life because at 12 years old, at his Jupiter return, he lost his left leg down from the knee to tuberculosis in his bones. And then When he was at his second Jupiter return, roughly around 24, he faced the prospect of losing his right foot to the same malady. And so he actually was insistent on finding not necessarily a cure, but saving his foot, because he would have been just confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. So he found a doctor who was able to save his right foot. And while he was in the hospital over a number of years, here's this chart I'll come back to in a minute. He wrote this poem, and maybe you've heard of this poem. I first encountered this poem in college, so I'm going to read it to you, and also those who are watching this virtually, I want you to be able to hear it, because I think it gives us a window into understanding resilience. And of course, the Scorpio sun will talk about this in terms of talking about some measure of healing and resilience. It's called Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloodied, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. Yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And so he was able to live some years and marry until a right young age. He actually fell off a train platform and ended up again in a hospital and died some days later. But this poem lives on, as well as his other poems and other stories that are related to him. And I like to share a little more and unpack this related to resilience, but talking about it from an astrological point of view. So what and where we astrologers usually look for trauma markers, an entry point into contemplating resilience. And I'm going to go to some of the standard things. Now, I'm not going to read everything that you see here because you can read. And I think what's important is less about what you're reading per se, as much as to know that these are generally things that we astrologers go toward when we start talking about someone's trauma. But I'm going to make a different argument to you tonight, but I am going to go over the normal places that we usually consider trauma. So this is from Christian Astrology, but from William Lilly. So if you're reading this and you're like, damn, that sounds severe, right? You know, in terms of, you know, like you have a sun in the 12th house or moon, private enemies, oh, witches, great cattle, horses, elephants, all manners of affliction, self-undoing, you know, it rules the man's body and the feet, okay? And then this is my own take on looking at the houses. Again, I won't dwell on this because I don't think it's as important, but it's dealing with the icky stuff when we start talking about the 6th, 8th, or 12th houses, at least traditionally. I think in a modern sense, we've been able to reform, reshape, and give a different sense of them, but it still deals with some measure of the anxiety and fear that we could talk about, or dowries or death for the 8th house, in terms of talking about routine areas of life for the 6th house, or in terms of health or illness, which is more the traditional take on it. And the 12th house, it's called the house of the bad daemon, right? It just sounds scary. So these are places where we usually look, but there's other places that we look too. So we look to the lunar nodes, and I'm giving you my definitions related to the nodes. We can supplant some of our own, but generally, if you want to look at the south node, that usually becomes related to our past, whether that's karma, quote unquote, from a past life, or the idea of past lives, or your immediate past, or from your ancestors. And the north node becomes more our conscious intention. Now, one of the things that my students are also used to is that I say the north and south node could be related to your dominant and less dominant hand. So we could think about the south node as more your dominant hand, because I don't remember when I became right-handed, right? But we have these moments where we have these things that come from somewhere, and the north node becomes what we have to cultivate and keep and maintain, which is more so the less dominant hand, depending on what hand you have. So that's one particular way we look at it. And then there's Chiron, of course. And Chiron, and I won't go so much into the story of Chiron, I will recommend that you listened to Jason Holly's talk this year in terms of talking about Chiron. So it gives a lot more of a thorough analysis related to it. But we can say that when we're talking about Chiron in the wound that we can't heal is how we deal with futility. So I look at Chiron as a measure of how we deal with building character in the face of no-win scenarios. Chiron also witnesses as we suffer. So it's kind of a co-participant in some way, as Jupiter's like merely watching, like, damn, that looks like it sucks, son. But Chiron is more participatory. And then, of course, we have the afflicted planets. Again, we can recommend Gray Crawford, who talked about debilitated planets. Give him some love, too. And looking at planets in detriment or fall and what that might mean, or planets in the 6th, 8th, or 12th houses if you are more traditional, or peregrine, or afflicted by the malefic, Saturn or Mars, or the fixed stars, or combust, or under the sunbeams, in and out of sect, depending on what sect lord or what sect we're talking about, or retrograde, slow in motion. Now, again, this is where we normally look. This is not me saying that if you have afflicted planets or in the 6th house or the 8th house or 12th house, you got trauma. I think on some level we all have trauma. We can talk more about that, but I don't know if we just localize it in these particular places. So I want to invite you to look at trauma a little differently. So we're going to move toward what we could say is a holistic contemplation of trauma and resilience in astrology. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, just in the interest of time and not keeping you here all night, going over the meanings of the planets. I am listing them there for you to be able to reference and you get a sense of where I'm coming from. I think about the moon as how we embody life purpose, a primary vehicle to engage the world around us. But again, and I mentioned also the cycles. I'm going to mention the cycles of each of the planets because how we understand the cycles as well as their significations become an entry point to how we might greet and understand trauma. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm from the church, so let me help you with that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Amen. Yes, whatever you want to say. Yebo, Ashe, you know, all those things. Trauma and the moon. So where's Cam? Is Cam here? Cam Allen? No. Cam, you didn't come out for me. Anyway, so Cam is someone who talks a great deal about embodiment in astrology. And historically, we would talk about the moon related to the body. Now, more in the modern sense, we've kind of translated that more to our emotions. But we have to start with some measure of dealing with body memory and what happens with our bodies. And so the moon can become a reflection on how trauma has changed our emotional responses and even our memories. How we might remember a particular situation may not be exactly how it played out. And your body may start to reabsorb and tell a different story that isn't the actual story. And the other thing to understand related to the moon, it's like a parasite, we could say trauma becomes, because parasites, how many of you have heard of toxoplasmosis, for instance? If you have cats, you know what I'm talking about, right? That particular affliction is a parasite that can actually rewire your actual brain and condition how you respond and deal with things. Trauma is a lot like that. And the moon tells some measure of that story. What's also important, and this is something more from Uranian astrology, it's important to look at the moon as we understand the daily architecture of our lives. What I mean by daily architecture, you're building something every single day. You're building something in your life, and we can call that the architecture of your life. And you're doing it brick by brick, moment by moment. So it's important to realize and think about how are you embodying what you are using from your moon, from trauma into your life. And you're likely doing it in ways like how you wake up, that determines it, what kind of music you listen to, what you start talking about. All those things become the ways that you start embodying trauma. So rather than looking at it like, oh, this is because my moon's in Scorpio, right? Or because my moon is afflicted by Saturn, it can become a general meditation. And one thing I find deep that I'm going to weave into each of these, and mainly for the first 7 planets, is I'm going to take a page from Dante's Paradiso, where he talks about each of the spheres of heaven, and those relate to the moon. And so the moon is actually the sphere of the inconstant. And what he means by that is where people fail to keep their own vows. Every single day, you are making a vow to yourself about something. Is that vow serving you? Or is it holding you back? Or is it propelling you forward? And so we can make vows that liberate us and help us, or we can make vows that chain us. And we can determine some measure of that. So we have to be attentive to the vows we're keeping and the vows that we definitely probably need to break. Mercury. Again, Mercury is the medium between how we understand lower and higher forms of consciousness. I say it's anything that deals with how we get from point A to B. I say it rules the 3 comms: communication, commerce, and commuting. So it's ways in which we make these particular aspects of connection. But when we're talking about Mercury retrograde is also a renewal cycle for Mercury on top of synodic returns that you might have. Like anyone 33 here, you likely had a synodic return with your solar return with Mercury. So that's kind of another aspect of it. Mercury's a little different when we talk about it from the moon. It's where our minds can become hyperactive and hypervigilant about possible threats, where we see a threat perhaps everywhere, which actually conditions the mind more toward anxiety. And that may be your mind trying to overcompensate for failing to catch the first trauma, even though you might have been one. We can lose our right minds with trauma overcome by the sun, like Mercury becomes combust. We must be mindful of the self-talk that is destructive. The things that you say to yourself, like, I'm just stupid, 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 stupid. How many times have you done that? Anyone else have done that? Right? So what are you saying to yourself? What are you teaching yourself? You're teaching yourself, and that's your trauma, teaching yourself that you feel stupid, although that may not be true. What's interesting about this with Dante is he says that this is the sphere of the ambitious, where those who sought a glory more than their works measured, which we can say we give more due to folks in our own pain than may be due, meaning that we assign things to ourselves that are probably greater than really that should be there for ourselves. It's best to do that with the virtue of justice or discernment, meaning discerning, like for instance, when you do something stupid, quote unquote, it may not be that you have to ascertain or say to yourself that you're stupid. It's like, I could have done that better. I could have done that differently. And monitoring and changing your self-talk. So one of the things that I'm talking about related to astrologers is that we always kind of want to get things right, right? We want to kind of say like, well, it's because of your Mercury in Scorpio, because of this, blah, 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 rather than just talking about, it may be some measure of how you're working with your Mercury, irrespective of just the placement. Venus, you know, the power of affinity and attraction and kindredship. And when we're talking about it with trauma, it becomes about how we reacquaint ourselves with a sense of similitude on what we like or dislike. Have you ever been the kind of person or known the kind of person who didn't know what they liked? Have you forgotten, also been at moments where you don't even know if you like that particular form of ice cream or this particular taste of something? Or you've forgotten that you really like to ride bikes, or that sense of connection that you have as you're really loving someone? Or you've been afraid of embracing, and I talk about this, some measure of your sexuality because you don't think dad will like it. Then that's where we have to think about trauma and Venus. It's also where we get neglectful with our self-care. You know, there's a phrase that we often say, look after yourself. Your failure to do that can be an articulation of your trauma and being incommunicado with your own Venus. The other thing I like to point out is that we tend to isolate rather than insulate. And what I mean as a distinction is isolate where we think like, well, no one's gonna care, no one knows, and we need to just go off by ourselves, rather than insulation is more when we create some measure of protection or dedication toward a particular purpose or a particular intention that we may have. Dante says that this is the sphere of the lovers, those who found a higher love after sublimating baser desires that cultivated temperance. I don't know if we have to go that far. I think it may be less about who we choose to love, but more how we choose to love them and ourselves, and being attentive to how we give that care to ourselves. And then we go to the sun. One particular idea I want to draw you to, other than just consciousness itself, how one feels connected to one's life purpose and divinity, is that the ego is nothing more than the focus of conscious attention. I really like that definition from Alan Watts. So it's where we direct that power we have to give focus in our lives. And this is where we start getting into the middle regions related to trauma, because this can become the cloud of self-doubt and shame in the human psyche, clouding self-expression and our own light. See, trauma's master stroke is convincing us that it's our destiny to be on the receiving end of more trauma for a multitude of reasons, that things won't get better. It is the denial of our divine right to be ourselves and be content. This means you live in the shadow of yourself. And I think that's important. Many of you here, and I know this because I've talked to many of you individually in some way, some of my students, some have been clients, different things, will suffer from something that we have come to call imposter syndrome, where you may feel like, well, how dare I be the person who can, do what Stephen Forrest does, or Rick Levine, or whatever, or Wade Caves, right? But that's you neglecting your own sun, your own divine right to be, to shine your light. As we say in the church, I'm going to shine, how does it go? Sorry. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Come on. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Remember that promise you just made to yourself. That's the power of the sun. And the other thing I believe, I'm saying this as a matter of opinion, when I talk about awe in that next bullet point you see, we may lose the ability to appreciate our illuminating beauty and shed that light with others. When I talk about awe, I don't believe you can say to someone, well, you need to humble yourself. Or I don't think you're humble enough. I think what you have to do is find something that leaves you full of awe, that humbles you. Now, for me, and probably for many of you, it's astrology itself. It's always so much to learn. And none of us, not one single one of us, has mastered it all. There's always more to absorb and understand and get into. Let that be your guiding light. Rather than thinking like, well, I just don't know as much as this person or that person, but you know what you know because that light has been given to you. This is what Dante calls as the sphere of the wise, which requires prudence. And prudence may be defined as the ability to judge between virtuous and vicious actions, not only in a generous sense or general sense, but according to the appropriate actions at a given time and place. That, I think, is one of the definitions of magic, knowing the right thing to do at the right place. And this is important for us astrologers because that's what we do. Doesn't matter if you're not an electional astrologer, right? You understand by virtue of transits or however you proceed with things, that there is a certain time and place for things, and to emanate that energy and to shine and to give your power, not your power away, but to share your power. Mars, the principle of assertion and self-definition. Trauma and Mars. Now, the tumescent rising nature of Mars, someone laughed at that word. Okay, good, Jen. Like, leave it to the Scorpio to talk about something like tumescent. dictates that energy must swell and express itself out of us in action and embodiment. Otherwise, it craters in our bodies, becoming depression, frustration, and even rage. Is Maurice Fernandez here? Okay, he's gone. So Maurice introduced this idea to me about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago in one of his talks. And it just rang so powerful because what he was saying about Mars, and that I'm also conveying, is that the nature of Mars requires the expression of energy and putting it out and embodying. If you don't release that energy, that trauma, that anger, and I'm going to put myself on the line and say this is particularly for women. Like, why are you singling us out? What's that about? Because a patriarchal society has told you that you can't express your anger. So you wonder why you are dealing with anxiety and depression, because it's living in your body. Mars is living in your body with nowhere to go. And you have to find, now don't come and punch me in the face. Actually, no, that comes from real, like, I'm realizing that it's actual trauma. I'm going to talk about boxing, and I actually made the mistake of teaching a girlfriend how to box until I made her mad. Anyway, we'll move on past that. I'll process that later. But it does become important to think about how we are dealing with our boundaries and when they've been crossed, and having the right to express that anger. Physical, emotional, and psychic self-defense is an important way to care for yourself. One of the things we don't like to talk about in our community is that sometimes when people are reading us or giving readings, or you go to an astrologer who does not know how to hold space for you, is that they may inadvertently curse you, express energy to you, and give energy to you that in some way you don't know how to move it in your body. And that becomes important for you to learn different ways to move that energy in your body so it doesn't get stuck there. So according to Dante, Rose, you are an angel. Thank you. You read my mind. Thank you. According to Dante, this is the sphere of warriors of the faith. Now, he meant literally Christians, but we can extend to that and make it to mean also fortitude. In Arabic, there is a word that relates to this that I think is even much more exact, which is called sabr. And sabr means patience in and perseverance in adversity. So when you are facing that, doesn't mean patience doesn't mean you sit quietly and just twiddle your thumbs or wait. It's kind of holding space to be determined to move onward and forward, while simultaneously finding the right time to do what needs to be done. It is to hold the course. All right, Jupiter. Now, contrary to what Wade Cave said, where is he? Okay, I don't hate Jupiter. Okay, I'm a Jupiter-ruled ascendant. I mean, he's in Virgo, but here's the issue. I think we overblow Jupiter and we blow smoke up Jupiter's butt all the time. And I think that's the issue. That's the issue I take with it. But Jupiter has some very important lessons to share with us, as you can see, and I also call them different names to match under. And I have to quote my homegirl, Ani DeFranco. And there's a song where she says, "Life used to be lifelike." And that actually is one of the powers of Jupiter, is kind of experiencing life in lifelike, or even sometimes larger than life terms. So the goal with Jupiter is not to curb our enthusiasm because we want to curb or curtail our expectations because of disappointment. Because trauma can exacerbate and then even exceed the nature of disappointment, making us live with that and feeling like we always have to curb our enthusiasm. and fear our enthusiasm. Like I'm psyched, but I don't want to be, right? So like you don't have to live that way. With trauma, we can say yes more to our excesses than to our excellence. But Jupiter can come as a correction for us to say, especially if Jupiter returns, to say yes more to our excellence rather than our excesses. Trauma may prompt us to choose probability over possibility continuously. What I mean by that, and many of us probably are guilty of this, is saying like, well, I'm just trying to be realistic. We did not evolve because we were realistic. We evolved because we were willing to entertain possibility and probability, taking chances, exactly, and being willing to go forward in the face of probability, entertaining what might be possible. This has happened in terms of good ways and bad ways. I think colonialism was probably too much expansion and too much entertaining possibility. Well, what if we went across the sea and encountered a whole bunch of people there, killed them, and took their land? Okay, but we don't have to entertain just that possibility. We can entertain the possibility that you already have exhibited. Coming here, many of you are first timers to this conference, right? How many people do we have, right? You exhibited a belief in possibility. You didn't know for certain how things were gonna go. Are they gonna like me? Am I wearing the right outfit? What if I sound like an idiot talking to like Stephen Forrest or whoever? And those are things that you might entertain as the worst possibility, but you also embraced other possibilities. That's Jupiter. And that's the beauty of Jupiter. And he says, Dante, that this is the spirit of the rulers who love justice. Now, with justice, we also can talk about, and this is a lesson more from the Kabbalah, where we talk about mercy. Justice also means avoiding harm and shielding those who have been harmed, including ourselves. Because sometimes it becomes easier that we seek to protect others than to protect our own sense of space, our own minds, our own hearts. And so you're doing an injustice to yourself, and you are embracing excesses. So also to maintain faith for us, or what's going to come to us, is a way of avoiding gluttony and envy. And what I mean by that, going back to the sense of faith, envy is where you really express a lack of faith. And envy is this idea that what's due to you won't come to you, or that you can't get it. Now, sometimes envy can be a very good messenger. Just don't keep that motherfucker in your house. You pay attention and say like, oh, I really do want to be a speaker at NORWAC. Who does she think she is? I can do that. Pay attention to that. Then figure out how that can happen and entertain the possibility. And by virtue of that, then have the faith and then stay the course, which is also Mars. This is why I've kind of given this. It's not for you just to think like, oh, he's going to go through each planet. All of them work together, because I'm getting ahead of myself. You have access to all of them. So Saturn, how we ground our role in society, all these different things, discipline, karma. So this is where we get into the burdens of shame and guilt. And as my friend Rick Levine has shared with us, Saturn loves words that go with like shame, should, shouldn't, shit. They likely emerge from the feelings of hopelessness and helplessness that comes from trauma, a conditioned response that we allow ourselves or we kind of lapse into. And then Saturn takes on the role as prosecutor and persecutor. But we forget a very important lesson with Saturn, leaning more into tactics and short-term fixes rather than embracing strategy and long-term thinking. My students and mentees will know that I'm the person that will ask them like, well, what do you want? What's your plan? I will say this, and Janelle, who's back there, who's known me, I think at least since 2009. And I'm not saying this to brag or to boast, but I want to say this because I think it's important. I am here on purpose. It was a strategy. There was a plan. And I'm saying that to you because it can be your plan, your strategy, and you can get where you want to go. But you have to respect Saturn and you have to respect your trauma and move through it. The other thing that can happen with Saturn is that we can confuse method with meaning. Meaning that, you know, we forget a very important lesson from the sun, remembering that, you know, we become astrologers, we learn, we do all these things, maybe we excel in a particular sport, maybe this is your second or third career. But all these things isn't so much about what you can do or your status or your role. You are far greater than any one of those things. You are the culmination. Let me just say this. You are the culmination of perhaps 4.5 billion years of evolution. There's been no creature like you on the planet. Even if they looked like you, or you had an ancestor who looked like you, they were not you. So the world has been waiting for you for a long time. Don't hide your light. How dare you deny the world your magnificence, your greatness, because of shame, those SH words that Saturn wants to pin on you. So as an effect, we can say Saturn or shame gets us to hide in the dark and loves to thrive in darkness. But we have to remember the dynamic between Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn honor the dynamic of bounding out, Jupiter, and then bordering in, knowing where you kind of contain spaces so that you can grow and flourish. You can incubate and insulate. According to Dante, this is more the sphere of the contemplatives, where we meet souls who reflect the mysteries of God in time and space. But this contemplation must not supplant caritas or love, because this becomes temperance. That balance between what we contemplate and understand, even from a distance, and how we move closer through love. I haven't forgotten the outers. So I want to say just something briefly because we're going toward the end of my presentation, or toward the last part of it. And I want you to contemplate some of the things that I'm talking about with the outers. So with Uranus, what I might say is that Uranus is kind of more so a chance to reshape the reality set by Saturn. It's that flash of insight. It's stepping beyond yourself. It's a course correction. One of the things I also believe that in the modern sense, we could say that Uranus is the realm of the demonic. And when I say the demonic, I mean more so getting to your sense of your genius, your unique aspect of yourself that you have to share. Whereas Neptune is where we might have gone from stepping beyond ourselves to the sublime. And sometimes the sublime can be just delusion, or delusions of grandeur or conspiracy, confusion in our model thinking. What I mean by reliance on the law of attraction is more so where you may have forgotten, because one of the problems we can talk about with the law of attraction is not so much that I'm doubting the idea of the law, but you might be trying to draw shit to you that's not for you, right? You may be saying like, well, I want $1 million. Why? I don't know. I want to draw that, right? So you have to be clear. And one of the gifts of astrology, one of the gifts for us as astrologers, we can start talking about what we might want, or what a client really desires, what belongs to them. When I was younger, for obvious reasons, I wanted height. And I didn't get that. I couldn't attract that. But one of the things I've come to realize that comes from age, I wouldn't have been me. I wouldn't have relied on other gifts. So you have to be very mindful of what you're trying to draw to you, because it may be a delusion and going against what might be in your best interest. And it may draw you more toward isolation where we can embrace compassion, community, and humanity. Last but not least is Pluto. And one thing I like to say, I realized as I was preparing for this talk, Pluto is where Neptune's illusions are buried and dreams. So Pluto's like, yeah, give me that. So this is where we have to excavate different depths to know our true measure and what lurks beyond our personal history and narratives, to get to the nitty gritty, to go deeper, to extract the toxicity we've allowed to seep into us and find the treasures that are really there, to move from the toxicity to treasures, which are there. And I can assure you, you have the treasures in you. So, shifting resilience. How can we think about resilience? Living between or betwixt possibility and probability. So I want to mention Muhammad Ali. One of the stories I want to share, and this is his chart, and I mean, many astrologers have talked about his Mars and Taurus at the midheaven here. I don't know if my arrow is showing, is it? Yeah. Mars near his midheaven in Taurus, squared within a degree to his Pluto, being a Leo rising. And why I'm highlighting this chart is that he's had to deal with the sense of combat and some way of fighting, perhaps all his life, starting from when he was 12 and he had his bike stolen. And he actually wanted to learn how to fight so that if he ever encountered the people who stole his bike, he beat them up. But some of you may not be old enough to remember the rumble in the jungle. I do vaguely remember some measure of this fight. I was about 7, and I know some of you might feel like, oh, boxing is such a vulgar sport, right? Well, my father was a fight trainer, and he put me in a ring when I was 9. And one of the reasons why I think it was very gracious for Wade to call me a hero, but one of the reasons if I am a hero is because of my father. Because as I may have mentioned before, I was born with multiple birth defects, spina bifida, club feet, a solitary kidney, neurogenic bladder, all these particular things. And I was very angry as a kid and got in a lot of fights. I mean, the kind of fights where I would walk past the bully because I wanted to kind of be on the jump and say like, yeah, mama. and then actually would get, beat up. And he did something very wise. He decided, I think it's wise. He decided to put me in a ring and train me how to fight. And I didn't get in any more fights because I didn't have that confidence then. So I actually do believe in boxing, and this particular fight stands out as something very powerful. So one of the big fights that Muhammad Ali got in actually was with the US government because he refused to accept the draft to fight in the Vietnam War. And he was denied a passport and a boxing license, even though he was not put into jail, until the US Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 1971. So he actually had a chance to fight the new heavyweight champion of the world, George Foreman. And that was to take place in September, but George Foreman experienced a cut over his eye, and the fight was delayed by a month. Now, George Foreman, you might know of him now, many of you, only from like grills. But when he was younger and a boxer, he was a scary dude. He was huge. He had knocked out and demolished Ken Norton and Smokin' Joe Frazier from Philly in early rounds, and both of them had beaten Muhammad Ali. So Muhammad Ali went into this fight as the 4-1 underdog, where everyone believed that his glory days were over. Now, as you see there, spoiler alert, Ali wins, but how does he win? How does this become a story related to resilience? What Ali did, knowing that George Foreman was a younger fighter, strong, is that he decided, using his Mars-Pluto square, his sixth house sun, if you use whole sign houses, his moon, all these different aspects of his chart, he decided that he was going to do two things to George Foreman. He was going to become a punching bag for George Foreman on the ropes, which is called rope-a-dope, and being willing to take his punches. And by virtue of being able to take those punches, he was going to outlast him and make him expend his energy. And so George, at the fourth round, realized that he was getting petered out after having hit Muhammad Ali so much. And then that's when Muhammad Ali went to work and knocked him out in the eighth round. And that was Capricorn. That was Saturn. That was using Saturn. That was using his Mars. So when we start looking at, because what we'd like to do as astrologers is pick and choose and like, oh, I'm going to do this, but we have access to all of the heavens. In Kabbalistic thought, the idea is that we as human beings, and I'm not saying that this is completely true, but it's something to entertain. We as human beings can go beyond the pale of the sun. We can go beyond the middle star and reach the whole of all the heavens, which, according to that tradition, no other creature on this planet or beyond, including angels, can do what we do. And so we as astrologers have this ability to channel the whole of the heavens. So what I want to start to close on is this quote from Paul Conte, where we might need to modify, we do need to modify what Nietzsche said. It's not true that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. What doesn't kill us can actually leave us with wounds that make life a lot more difficult. That being said, what doesn't kill us can make us wiser, more grateful, and more compassionate. And when it comes to the bigger picture, not only helping ourselves, but also helping others and the world, compassion makes all the difference. So this leads us to embracing something Nietzsche did say, amor fati, to love your fate. And that's going according to something that is in the Bible, where it says in 1 Corinthians 13:13, and now abideth faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity, is love. And loving your fate doesn't mean acceptance of all of it in terms of resignation or just kind of just accepting it without really being fierce about it. It means recognizing that our trauma can become indispensable in becoming more of what we are. It's loving it to the point like you love something fiercely that you're going to see it through. Contemplating the planets and the multiple ways we count their cycles can help us deal with the complexities of our traumas, positioning us at various times as victors rather than just victims. But here's the thing, I think it's important to say. No one promised us victory every single time. We are at some point going to lose some battles. We are actually going to lose this battle for life. You are going to die, every single one of us in this room. So we may not win that particular battle. But I think the goal related to resilience in astrology is to fight as many of them as we can well and claim the victories that we can. And whatever gets lost, we'll count that to fate or fortune. And let that be more the motivator for us to accomplish more. We have to figure out in that process how much we can do and take, because we don't fully know how much we can endure and take until we start going there. We kind of conjecture, we like to get to the moments even when we're talking about, predicting things, like I predict that a parent might pass or something like that. But we don't know how that feels until we experience it. It's one thing to predict it and feel like, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen. It's another thing to live with it and to feel it and to move through it and to use the planets to understand ourselves. So our work as astrologers may be less about predicting times of triumph and trauma and more about helping others to remember and access ways We can triumph over trauma, even when the victory is bittersweet or meager. These triumphs may not always be visible. So let's talk some real talk for a second. Some of you have gone through very severe trials and tribulations to get here. Some of you are dealing with the loss and the recent loss of parents, of beloved pets. Some of you are dealing with aches and pains and things that are scary in your body. Some of you are dealing with also having lost partners, whether to death or divorce or just distance. We're all going through some dimensions of pain. And some of us have been putting up happy faces, and some of us have experienced happiness genuinely at this conference. But the thing to remember as we've come together and we've dealt with this pain or not dealt with this pain is that we still have each other. We also have the stars. And to remember that gift, that we can tap into other worlds, whole aspects of consciousness in ways that many people can't even fully dream of. But we forget that. And we kind of go more so for wanting to be right more than wanting to be loved. Wanting to argue among ourselves, well, which house system do you use? Or are you tropical or sidereal? Right? We want to play ourselves so small. I'm already short, don't get small. We can be so much bigger than what we are because we have access to a whole cosmos. What does Demetra George say? If it's in the sky, it's also in the psyche. So it's important to remember that we have access to the sky and the psyche. How dare we forget who we are? You, despite your trauma, despite having the travails that you've endured to come here, despite the heaviness that may be in your heart, you have access to luminescence in the sky. And that luminescence, we believe, is resonant and embodied in your very heart. So it is important for you to let your heart shine, not rather than just embrace the power of your mind and your intellect and how you can woo other people. It is to recognize that you actually can use that to lighten their load, lighten your load, and get beyond your trauma and go into that range of being that we call resilience and defy and become the captain of your soul, the master of your fate. So your trauma of whatever kind, even if your life has been superb by all counts, is still yours to define and to discover. And your trauma may be, well, about discovering that trauma and the pain of others, like of any kind. But the planets give you that guide, that ability to suss through it and reach a truth that otherwise wouldn't be visible. This is our power. This is what I want you to remember. This is how we get to that point of that resilience and beyond. Thank you.